Let me tell you what I want to talk about today and how I'd like to do this. I want to talk about ethics and the absolute co-joining of ethics and leadership, and the need for leadership to draw the line very early and very hard on ethics, and that is to say, not to truck any violation of ethics. And hopefully why I hold that so dearly will become obvious to you as we go through this. But I am going to sort of break my discussion, or our discussion, down along these 5 areas. I want to give you the setting, which this place at the time was called Pinkville, and as we go through our discussion will become recognizable to you as an historical event you've heard about. And then I don't wish to jump right into the details of what happens at Pinkville, because to me what's interesting is the way in which leaders and systems react to indicators of trouble at Pinkville and what they do about it. And from that I wish to talk in this environment, i.e. the environment of Pinkville, about authority lines and systems that should have been operating, and then as we get into that, to translate it into the corrections department. Because I think the parallels we draw from the scene I'm about to describe to you and the importance of our business are very close. And I would like to leave with the idea that there are some principles that apply. And the reason I've asked for this particular group, by the way, is of course you're an esteemed group in my opinion, but I also recognize you as esteemed leaders. And I'm hoping that you will take this message and pass it on. If somehow I could get this to the whole department, I would do so, but I cannot. So I'm really relying on each of you to get with your people, and perhaps not exactly like this or not even the same example, to pass it on. So that's how the day will go this morning. A couple of hours with a break and a discussion that will follow, I would hope, in the second hour. Let me begin with the setting. It is the spring of 1968. America is involved heavily in Vietnam. We're essentially in the 4th year of that war. We've come through a major offensive, Tet Offensive. Our death rates are pushing up into the tens of thousands. Tet, which had occurred at the end of January 1968, was particularly brutal, although tactically it pretty much had broken the back of the enemy, a site sort of lost to history because Tet also was the turning point of American opinion towards the war in Vietnam. And this has some bearing on the story I'm about to tell. But I come to one division in Vietnam. It's the Americal. It's commanded by a general by the name of Sam Coster. If you go to my office, you'll see my certificate of graduation from West Point, and the man that signs that was the superintendent of West Point, Sam Coster. This is not a good story about Sam Coster, but time marches on and we learn a lot. The Americal had entered into Vietnam late in 1967. So essentially they've had about 4 months in country, and already they've begun to turn over some of the manpower in Vietnam. The division, by the way, is very huge. Runs about, it can vary in size from 15, 16, 17,000. The Americal was trained in Hawaii, and ironically, in the summer of 1967, I joined the brigade that becomes part of the Americal. In fact, as a cadet out of West Point for some summer training, I joined the very brigade I'm going to talk about. So what I'm indicating to you, there's some intimacy personally that I have with this particular unit, although I must say to my recollection, I do not remember having directly met any of the people I'm about to talk about. There is, on March the 14th, 2 days preceding the operation I'm about to describe, a small engagement where a sergeant in C Company of 1st of the 20th Infantry, which I will talk about here as a C Company of Task Force Barker, loses a soldier to a booby trap. He is killed, a very popular sergeant, good sergeant, and 2 others are wounded, one of whom is blinded by the event. So we have a unit that recently has suffered 3 casualties at the hands of the enemy. And on March the 15th, they are prepared for a mission that will take place the following morning on March the 16th. Let me describe that mission and ask you to look on over here. You can put your chair around. But you need to understand the setting and the mindset of the soldiers going in. It's going to be an air assault. This arrow indicates air assault. And this is the landing zone. And I'm describing essentially the operation by Charlie Company, led by a captain by the name of Medina. And Medina is to land in this landing zone and to put a platoon on the left and a platoon on the right, and a platoon in reserve, which is usually the way you do it, 2 up, 1 back, and to press in on Pinkville. Now, Pinkville is not actually Pinkville. It's what the soldiers called it and how it was labeled for the operation. This is actually a sub-hamlet of a village, this being a larger village, and historically and accurately, the village is known as My Lai 4. They're to sweep in there, and their enemy, they're told, is the 48th Viet Cong Battalion. Now, a battalion varies in size. A Viet Cong unit of that size would be between 300, 500, perhaps 600. So you have one company, which is slightly less than 100 because of casualties, landing in this landing zone, and then moving through a number of rice paddies into the village, only about 200 yards away, not very far. The idea is to push the enemy out, and there are other American units working the area. So flush them out and destroy them. It's a close and destroy mission, standard mission for the infantry. And Captain Medina, on the night of the 15th, gives a pep talk to the company. Historically, later on, lots of versions of that pep talk. But essentially is we have a severe enemy, and our reputation as a fighting unit's at stake, and we need to get them. The operation kicks off, as an operation of that type would, with an artillery preparation fired into the landing zone. So that means you have about 10, 12 hard minutes of artillery barrages coming in. That's to make sure there's no enemy in the way, because it's very vulnerable when you put the helicopter down. And the first platoon, which is going to be the platoon that goes to the right, is led by a platoon leader by the name of Lieutenant Calley. And Calley gets out and pushes forward to the edge of the LZ, or the landing zone, with his platoon. And then right behind that, another 9 or so helicopters come in, land second platoon, and you now have the first 2 platoons in. They start moving out as the arrows show. Second platoon on the left, first platoon on the right. Just to help you keep this straight, this is Lieutenant Calley. This is Lieutenant Brooks. Now, historically, we know a lot about Calley. We know virtually nothing about Brooks. He was killed shortly after this operation. When you go in like this, there's a number of people that are involved. First of all, I mentioned an artillery prep went in. That means someone is calling for fire, observing it, and adjusting it, and reporting on the effects. So you have, separate from the unit going in, a whole nother reporting chain. And that's a key point here, reporting chains. Because we have in our department many reporting chains and many observers of events. Later on that morning, the artillery will claim they killed 69 enemy due to artillery fire. The initial report from Calley, up through his captain, Medina, is that the LZ is hot, meaning there's enemy on the LZ and the returning fire. That changes. Turns out there are no enemy on the LZ, and there is no return fire. But that was the initial report. It appears that even those on the ground later on realized there was nothing going on there. And the platoon moves out. Now, while that's going on, there are other units moving. I put another company over by the South China Sea. That blue zone is the beautiful South China Sea. This is a land area that abuts the South China Sea. So to some degree, the operation sees them pressing the enemy against the sea. There's no escape to the sea. And there's a river to the north, and that's the The black mark to the south is a road. And we are putting up in the air a lot of helicopters. So in addition to the artillery, it's interesting to note there are a lot of helicopters up in the air. Now, the way in which commanders tended to operate in Vietnam, you would have the company commander on the ground, and sometimes the battalion commander on the ground. He's a lieutenant colonel, has about 3 or 4 companies under his command. In this particular case, his commander, Lieutenant Colonel Barker, was in a helicopter, probably at about 1,000 feet. And at about another 2,000 feet above that, you had the brigade commander, a man by the name of Henderson. So what you have to envision is troops on the ground with commanders at varying altitudes overhead, and they're flying back and forth. They're not staying there because they've got other units to look at, but they're overhead, and they're particularly overhead from about the time the platoons go in, 7:30 till sometime after 8. So again, you have artillery, helicopters, hit the ground, move out, reports of fire, the rest of the company gets in, and commanders overhead. One other thing. Since the idea is to flush out the enemy, you also have gunships up in the air. These are other helicopters or armed helicopters. And there was a tactic at that time to have a lighter, faster helicopter, not necessarily armed, and his job was to draw fire. He was to smoke out the enemy, actually draw the fire of the enemy, and then the gunships would swoop in and take out the enemy. Pretty dangerous job, but that's the way you did it. So if you envision this, you've got, maybe 100 troops on the ground, you've got commander on the ground, commanders in the air, you have supporting units with that infantry company moving, like the artillery observers. You also have interpreters and intelligence people that are there to interrogate prisoners. So you have a lot of people directly in the chain of command and a lot of people adjacent or overhead observing what's happening. Lots of witnesses, lots of sources of information. That's the only picture I want to give you at this particular time. The operation proceeds. Essentially, it's over by about 12:30 as they sweep through the village of My Lai. And I say village, that's actually not accurate. My Lai is a sub-hamlet, and it turns out all of those other red crossword puzzle symbols I put up here, these are clusters of villages that together form a larger village, of which My Lai 4 is only one. The number of people in this village, My Lai 4, is unclear, but it was a large village or sub-hamlet. It was more than 200 or 300. Some reports said as many as 600. These are basically thatches of villages and some brick, not much brick, but some brick. Shortly after the platoons move out, fires are noted in My Lai 4. Now, what's interesting is by this time in Vietnam, we are learning that the tactic is to win the hearts and minds of the people. So there are divisional standard operating procedures that say do not destroy civilian homes, do not kill civilian livestock, do not harm civilian non-combatants. That is a standard operating procedure. And I might add that all the soldiers are carrying a card. Know of anybody else that carries a card? Pocket card in the jungle. This, by the way, is not jungle. This is rice paddy land, farmland. And on that card, it says something like, the enemy is in your hands. And it talks about how to deal with the enemy, but how to deal with civilians. And it's part of the training. So they move in. As always, there are some side movements. Lieutenant Brooks on the north is told to cross that river. He goes up to another village, and then later on comes back. The company commander is moving mostly with Callie's platoon, and he reports through Pinkville mid-morning, and essentially combat operations cease for Charlie Company shortly after noon. And other operations are ongoing. This operation ends up with reporting killing 128 enemy combatants, which is pretty big for a company to take on. Also reports one man wounded. He's wounded in the foot. So they've lost one wounded. They've killed 128 enemy. And they report capturing 7 weapons. Later on, that turns out to be 2 weapons. But the initial report is 7 weapons. Now let's come to the end of the day. The division reports up higher that they've had the greatest single operational success in their short history in Vietnam. The commanding general is very proud of that. Brigade commander is very pleased. By the way, it's his first day in command. He took over the day before. So it's also his first combat operation in his life. But he's very proud, and the division actually publishes a praiseworthy press release article about 2 days later, which talks about the tremendous victory that was achieved. There are promotions given and awards given, and lots of valor is claimed. Pretty good operation as described. That's the setting. March 16th, 1968. Time passes, and some soldiers begin to get antsy and start talking. There is the possibility one soldier is going to write his congressman that he's concerned about some things he's seen, but his company commander tells him, don't do that. This is our business, internal affairs. If you write your congressman, you'll be tampering with investigations that are ongoing. What are the investigations? Well, when Captain Henderson was flying around, he saw a couple of Vietnamese bodies lying on some of the roads and trails. And then later in the day was told that a helicopter pilot, interesting man by the name of Thompson, has been reporting objectionable actions at the village of My Lai 4. Thompson will wait 30 years to get recognized for his heroic actions on this day. But he is agitating. He's saying something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong. And so we do have a stated investigation going on. It is verbal. There is nothing written down. Turns out at the end of the day, there's real no record of this. There are claims that there are written records, but they're never produced, never found. And there is, 2 years later, a whole review to see what was done and what investigations ensued. The unit breaks up, soldiers are reassigned, some die, as you've heard, some get out. In March of 1969, the Chief of Staff of the Army receives a letter from an ex-soldier, not a high-ranking officer, but an ex-soldier by the name of Ridenour. And Ridenour writes a very disturbing letter where he says, I entered the Army and trained up with these people. Later on, we split up. I never served with the Americal, but some of my friends did, and I've seen them since. And they all tell me a corroborating story, which is very troublesome. And he takes them back through the operations on March the 16th. Now slightly, not slightly, grotesquely different versions. So the Chief of Staff of the Army, about a year later, has a letter from essentially a private soldier. He's gotten some rank in the Army, but he's enlisted man, very low-ranking enlisted man. Interesting. It's a serious letter. He has to treat it seriously. About that time, there's a investigative reporter named Seymour Hirsch, who's still around today. Depicted, by the way, and I think he would probably say this so, as a very liberal, muckraking reporter. He begins to interview people about what happened at My Lai 4. And sometime in the fall of 1969, there's a lieutenant general by the name of Pierce. this is General Pierce here, was appointed by the Chief of the Staff of the Army to conduct an investigation of My Lai. This is his book, the My Lai Inquiry, written 10 years after the investigation. It's different from the report he rendered at the end of his investigation in that this is much more open. And this is what I am basing much of my discussion with you on, although there are many other sources. But the Peer Commission report is compelling because it indicates for certain something very different from what I described about 10 minutes ago happened at My Lai 4. And then finally on December the 5th, 1969, Life magazine publishes pictures taken by a public affairs enlisted man present. It's entitled The Massacre at My Lai. I have a Xerox copy of it, but in its time, it was a very famous article. And the writer, please pass that along, if you will. The author of it is actually the photographer who took the pictures. The photographer who took the pictures. Hold that thought. Published a year and a half later. The publication of these pictures are electric. They polarize the United States. They have great impact on the conduct of the war and public perception of the war. That's the setting. Story that's reported immediately the day of the action and the aftermath. Now, I want to go back over this in detail, and I want to, for the first time, invoke some of your insights. Indications of trouble. On the day of March 16th, did anyone note any indications of trouble? Fires in the village.
The guy in the helicopter.
Man in a helicopter reporting.
All those hostile so few weapons.
Excellent point. Let me take some of these, and there's more, but let's start with these. Fires. You have an SOP that says, don't burn down civilian homes. What's burning? The village of My Lai. At the end of the day, everything's burnt. The whole village is gone, as are many other villages. Observed by the commander, Barker, by Medina on the ground certainly, by all the helicopter pilots, and by the brigade commander and the division commander, who also gets in that circle of hornets up in the air watching this. Later on in the day, when reports of the helicopter pilots concerned start filtering up the chain of command, Henderson is sent back. Remember, he's the brigade commander. He flies over again, and he notes that all the villages are burnt down. So he sees it early, and he sees it late. He sees it burning. He sees the ashes. What was the other thing we said after fires?
Weapons.
Okay, weapons.
Two weapons.
Right. You don't get an operation against a battalion, a tough battalion, kill 128 and not take any weapons. What are they fighting with? They're fighting with weapons. If 128 are dead, they didn't pass the weapons off before they died, nor did their friends and peers, many who were killed, run the weapons back to the rear. There's some of that, and you may not get a 1-for-1, right, Jack? But you're not going to get 7, and you're certainly not going to get 2. Prisoners. No prisoners. No. Wounded. How many wounded? Where is he shot? What does that tell you? He shot himself in the foot. That's correct. That's what he did. Why do you think he shot himself in the foot? Was he scared of the enemy? He was sickened by what he saw. He couldn't stand it. He wanted to get out of there. There are indications that are happening almost instantly that any trained professional, which all of us are, would start picking up on. Why is there smoke when we're not supposed to be burning villages? Why did we 128 and 7 weapons? That was the original report. There is a moment in the morning where, remember I said Henderson had seen some dead Vietnamese? He asked are there any civilian casualties? And it takes a couple hours, but later on in the day he gets a report 20 to 28. 20 to 28. Now I will tell you, for any professional unit, you get 20 to 28 civilian casualties. What do you think we do, Inspector General? Investigate. You can't have 20 to 28 civilian casualties and not investigate. That's not a norm. That's not collateral damage. Let's talk about one of the heroes of this. There aren't many, but one of them, the helicopter pilot, Hugh Thompson. In November of 1998, 30 years later, I have the privilege of going to the Vietnam Wall in Washington, representing my position in the White House and the Drug Control Office, and congratulating Hugh Thompson for his heroic actions on March 16, 1968. Here's what he did. Remember, he's the guy that is to bait the enemy. So he's flying low in an unarmed helicopter, and he's got weapons on it, but essentially he's to draw fire. As he's flying low like at 30 feet, he is seeing Vietnamese all over the place. And they're wounded, some are dead, and many are fleeing. And he goes back and forth, and he's not drawing any fire. He then observes in the vicinity of My Lai a huddle of civilians with soldiers around them. They seem to be firing at the civilians. And he becomes highly agitated. And he starts calling out over the radio, something's going on there, something's wrong at My Lai. Now, because of communications problems, he's only talking to other helicopter pilots. He can't get through to his headquarters. At about, not sure of the time, 8:45, 9 o'clock, he lands his helicopter. And he goes up to a couple of American soldiers, and there are a group of Vietnamese, many of whom are wounded. And he says, you need to help them out. And he gets the answer, yeah, we'll help them out okay. We'll put them out of their misery. He actually thinks that's a joke. He's stunned. He gets back in his helicopter and he takes off. A few minutes later, he sees more shooting. He is absolutely beside himself. He lands his helicopter again, and he tells his door gunners he's to shoot any American that fires into any more Vietnamese civilians. And then he walks up to a hut where 9 Vietnamese, not clear, 9 to 12 women and children are huddled, and he gets them out. And he calls in one of those other helicopters to get them out. He gets them out. He is facing off his fellow American soldiers, all who are armed to the teeth and in a combat operation under threat of death, and gets them out. Now, Thompson is, say he's perplexed and agitated is understatement. He brings this to his company commander. Helicopters exist in companies too. And he has a company commander, and the company commander brings it to his battalion commander. So we now have another chain of command that's operating. And Chaplain Taylor, he brings it to his chaplain, which when you think about it, would be quite the norm. To whom do people go when they're troubled by what seems to be a very heinous event? They start going to officials they think have the authorities to help them, or the spiritual guidance to ease their suffering. So we now get into the question of what are the authority lines and what do people do about it? There actually are many command hierarchies I've talked about. There's the infantry unit up through the division. There's the artillery battalion. There is a public affairs group that's in there. There is now the chaplain's corps, There's the IG system. There's the division SOPs, policies. There's something else, Kathleen's called the rule of land warfare, the law, which all soldiers and officers are briefed on and trained on, what you can do and what you cannot do. But here are the leaders. At the end of the day, no real investigations and certainly no written reports. And the claim of victory, tremendous claim of victory. Now let's freeze frame and go back. What does a division headquarters look like in the field, Colonel Grant?
Got a division commander, they've got division staff. They have under that number of brigade commanders, but they have a number of people to help them with all these different things in the same chain.
They are a lot of people with authority and rank, and they live together, and they eat together, and they converse. You have to picture a division headquarters in Vietnam may have, amongst ranking officers, 100 or more. And they'll have an officer's mess. And every night, like people usually do, they'll get together in the mess hall and they'll talk about things. You think they might talk about the greatest victory the division ever had to date in Vietnam? A lot of people talking to each other. They include the JAG, the Judge Advocate General, the Inspector General, all of the senior commanders, the public affairs officer, the intelligence officer, the operations officer. It goes on and on and on. Something's going on here, but what are the signs of trouble? I'm back to that. We got through a few of them. Any more signs of trouble? Bodies laying in the road. Also, a number of bodies found in ditches. I'll come back to that one. Other signs of trouble? False report of heavy fire. The original report of 69 killed in action after the artillery barrage. That doesn't seem to make sense. Jack?
If the combat's that intense, why is the second platoon sent off across the river?
Pardon me?
If the combat is that intense, why is the other platoon sent north?
Yeah, you don't usually take a battalion on one platoon, do you? The other platoon's held in reserve, but it is a good tactician. By the way, Lieutenant Brooks's sojourn up north is terrible too. That's things that happen to My Lai 4 happen elsewhere. That Bravo company of Task Force Barker along the ocean is terrible as well. I'm trying to focus, though, on a contained event that we know an awful lot about. And my argument is on that very day, a lot of people knew a lot about. Yes?
Didn't anybody go back in there and do like an accounting like we do on our use of force, or say if there's a disturbance, we go in and just to clear the air and make sure you have the right score, the right situation?
Good point. We haven't talked about this yet. Does a village have a mayor? Yeah, you're the village chief. He's actually on our side. This is a country under the control of the government of Vietnam. He may be a Viet Cong, we don't know that, but ostensibly is on our side. And he is going to get reports from his people that something's gone wrong. And he does. And he immediately starts reporting that up the chain, and he's got with him officials of the Vietnamese army. And they are trying to subdue his report. Why would the members of the Vietnamese army try to subdue a village chief's report? Any ideas?
They were part of the conspiracy.
They're not part of the conspiracy, but who are they dependent on to survive in Vietnam?
American Army.
Well, they don't want any trouble with the American army. The village chief, though, starts to render reports. Now, how do we receive those reports? VC propaganda. There goes the Viet Cong again, trying to lay out propaganda. Let's come back to the photographs. What's the purpose of a public affairs guy taking photographs? Pardon me? Chronicle them? When do these photographs get out? Who has the photographs? The photographer. It's really interesting. It's a little bit side stuff. Always be wary of what you read. If those of you who got the Life magazine article, would you just hold it up for a second? It's working its way. That's written in the words of the photographer who sold them to Life magazine. Now, in his words, he's terrified by what he's seen. He's disgusted. So now he's done justice. He's gotten it out. He's done his duty before God and country. A year and a half later, when the price was right, he offered those photographs for sale many times. Didn't get his price. Never shared it that we know of with anybody in the chain of command. Really interesting.
Criminal?
Is that criminal? Piers thought it was. Piers, at the end of his report, talked about a lot of criminal behavior. How many were tried for My Lai? Anybody know? One. One person. We have lots of opportunities here for people to pick up that not only has something small gone wrong, but something huge has gone wrong. But it's not getting out. Now, what happens when a wrong doesn't get out? Any ideas there?
It's repeated.
It's perpetuated. Now, look, you're hearing this from a veteran who is very proud of the American Army, who actually served in Vietnam, and very proud of the American soldiers that served there. So I do not delight in telling you its worst story, nor do I delight in telling you that a lot of authority figures failed in their duty. But you have to freeze frame on those things, because there is an ethical problem here that has enormous consequences in the measure of humanity. Let's go back to the loss of the sergeant on March the 14th. Good man, dead. How do you think that affects a unit? They were enraged. Soldiers enraged. What do good leaders do when they have enraged followers? Dr. Bedard?
Try and quell their rage.
Settle them down.
Settle them down.
We're professionals. We're not brutes. We're professionals. We're not vigilantes. By the way, Jack, you're a veteran of 173rd Airborne in Vietnam. How heavy is one casualty? How is that considered in a company, the loss of one man?
Operationally,
Yes.
not terribly severe.
It's a terrible tragedy in terms of human loss. You lose a man in combat in an infantry company, in close combat, you got off light. You got off light. It's, I think, hard for you to realize that, but sitting in this room, and many of you not having been in combat, but you go into combat like this, close combat with a battalion, you're hoping you're going to get away with less than 25% casualties. So actually it's pretty light, but you have enraged unit. The commanders play on that. Why do you think it's called Pinkville? Right. Back in those days, you know, it was the Red Scare. Red was bad. Notice how I put up red for the enemy, blue for the good guys. That's a convention used today. Red is bad guys. Pinkville are bad guys. A 48th Viet Cong battalion's in that village. What does that imply to enraged soldiers? Payback. Everybody in the village is the enemy. Why do you think they burned down the houses? No return fire. The enemy. The enemy. The enemy. They had a word for the enemy. It was a racial slur used widely called gook. And when you get back to the prep talks given by commanders, is we're going to get those gooks. Now, language to me is important. You've seen a tape I put out on language. Why is language important? Because language is a reflection of culture. Culture set large, the English language, the French language. Culture set small, the way we talk to each other, the jargon of our profession, the acronyms we use, how we talk to women, how we talk to children. Language is a reflection of our culture, the way we think, the way we act. When you begin to call people something other than human, they become something other than human. And it presages terrible acts, because after all, you're not dealing with humans. You're dealing with the enemy, but worse than the enemy, you're dealing with some subhuman life form that probably doesn't deserve to live. Lots of lines of authority, lots of observations, again and again and again and again. Now, why don't people report? Chaplain Taylor, why do you think the chaplain of the division, who heard from the chaplain of the artillery battalion the first-hand account of Warrant Officer Thompson's depictions, why do you think he doesn't report? He didn't want to what?
Make his company look bad.
Well, it's a division, so, right? He didn't want to make the division look bad. Was that pride of division, pride of unit?
Yes.
Anything more than that, you think?
His personal counseling taking place.
He didn't want to be the one to raise the flag.
Sure. Any impact on his future in the Army, you think? Don't tick off the commander. The commander's got that. Good old Sam Coster, he's going to report this. Henderson, he's doing an investigation.
Career buster.
Career buster. When you got right down to his career buster, appears in his report, wanted to court-martial the chaplain. The Army said, don't court-martial the chaplain, for God's sake. The chaplain. How's that going to look? The Inspector General. Where does the Inspector General hang out? IG. An Inspector General in division is going to be a Lieutenant Colonel. He should be going out snooping around, but he's going to spend most of his time at headquarters processing investigations and reports. How could he not have gone to dinner on the night of March the 16th, on the night of March the 17th, and the 18th, and so on, and not gotten onto an indication something's wrong? Is that possible?
Lack of independence.
Lack of independence for what? To act?
For, yes.
Different viewpoint over here? He don't have to know, but he has to know maybe he should look. And maybe he could go to the division commander and say, sir, I've been hearing some pretty bad things. Let's take a look. Remember, this is depicted by the unit as a great victory. You don't take great victories lightly. You have a clear report of 20 to 28 civilians killed. You have no weapons. You have burning huts. You have lots of opportunities to look. And people deny those opportunities. They don't take them. And the real troubling question, the real perplexing, the real introspection is why don't they take them? If you have a corrupt unit, why would you condone that?
Because the people who were supposed to be over that unit were apparently involved. Where do you go?
How do you have
You're
two
afraid of public
Callies, and the captain had to be a Callie because he pointed out he was with that.
Let's talk about Captain Medina. Thank you. There's one of the things Thompson picks up on, he sees Captain walk up to a Vietnamese woman lying on a road, on a trail, and he pokes her with his foot, and he steps back and he empties his magazine into her. Brrr, M16. That gets up to Henderson. The following day, Henderson says, say I have a report, Captain Medina, that you shot a woman on the ground. He said, oh yeah, we were moving through and we had taken some fire. We'd returned fire. She was one of those we hit. When I went up to check them out, she made a quick move. I shot her with a reflex action. Magazine. Henderson thanks him for his verbal report. But we're onto something now. Was this a corrupt unit? Was that company on the ground corrupt?
Not to begin with, but after the incident, they became corrupt, I believe.
They were fired up, and once it started, I imagine it was a mess.
What corrupted them?
I would think that 3 days prior to, instead of discouraging, it was encouraged that it was going to be a revenge thing. For it to be at that level of rage and no one to do anything about it.
When you speak, as much as you can, speak up. By the way, we got you on camera. But I think people in the back like to hear you. I will tell you this. I'll get into it. I'll pick up on some of your comments. As this became investigated and eventually court-martialed, there were lots of reasons raised that the troops were fired up, the troops had suffered, they had lost casualties, this was war, this was close combat, it was over 100 degrees, the troops were exhausted, humma humma, blah, blah, blah. Beth, what do you think corrupted this unit? Leadership corrupted it. Leadership corrupted it. There was actually a survey made of the soldiers in the unit. They were of average or above average intelligence. This is the era of the draft. We're drafting people. We're taking people from across the spectrum. Now, a lot of them are trying to escape the draft, but you have a good cross-section of America that's picked up. This was a unit by Army's measurement. We take scores when we in-process them, of average or above average intelligence. Some of the senior leaders were the best of their time. Coster, as I said, he made a 3rd star. And went on to be the superintendent of West Point. The Army eventually took that star away from him, by the way, after the investigation. But people are people. This is the observation. Followers want to be led. And for the most part, they don't want to be corrupted. But they can be corrupted if the leadership allows that to happen and corrupts himself along the way. Ethics. Drawing the line early. Let me read some of the reports. Don't worry, I won't I won't overread, but just some vignettes to let you know what you find when you start to look and reflect. This is from the Peers Commission report. Remember, Peers wrote this book 10 years after he submitted his report. He was asked to be responsible and balanced when he submitted his report. He reported to the Congress of the United States. 10 years later, he wrote the book. He said much more. This is Peers reflecting at the end of his early inquiry, now a year and a half later. The early portion of the inquiry was like a nightmare to me. Initially, I had thought that perhaps a few civilians had been killed, but I didn't think it was going to such an extremely serious matter. However, when the facts started coming out and I became aware of the magnitude of the atrocity in terms of hundreds of civilians being killed, along with rape and the unwarranted destruction of property, I was stunned that these things could have been done at all, let alone by a U.S. Army unit. Once having recognized the extent of the tragedy, I became somewhat numb to the details given by subsequent witnesses. From that point on, the inquiry was just plain hard work. Peers was a tremendous combat veteran. In addition to other awards, held the Combat Infantryman Badge and the Silver Star. He was not a pushover. This is the Peers Commission report on what actually happened the morning of March 16th. I'll only read excerpts. This is Pierre's writing. At about 7:50 a.m., the two lead platoons started moving eastward through My Lai 4. That's those two platoons. Brooks on the left, Calley on the right. Calley's first platoon had only 2 squads instead of the normal 3, with a total strength of about 25 men. The right squad was commanded by Sergeant Mitchell, and Calley and his radio operator followed behind it. And then he mentioned some of the people in the chain of command. As they moved into My Lai 4, they shot numerous fleeing Vietnamese and bayoneted others. They also threw hand grenades into houses and bunkers, destroyed livestock and crops, and committed other atrocities. As they proceeded further, they began rounding up groups of civilians, women, children, and old men, and moving them along trails to the south and southeastern part of the settlement. One group of 25 to 50 was moved about 20 yards south of the hamlet along a dirt road leading toward Highway 521. That's the black line I'm showing, skirting the southern portion of the village. Another group of approximately 70 was moved into a ditch about 100 yards to the east. All this took place within about 45 minutes. A short time later, the group that had been moved south of the hamlet was shot down by members of the fire teams guarding them. A fire team then moved through the southern eastern part of the hamlet and rounded up 10 other Vietnamese and moved them into the area near the ditch. Subsequent testimony from Vietnamese witnesses indicated that other Vietnamese from nearby settlements either sought refuge in the ditch or were driven into it. Some estimates of additional people were as high as 50. Sergeant Mitchell's squad, less the fire team guarding the people in the ditch, and Bacon's squad moved another 50 to 100 yards each of the ditch and set up a defensive perimeter. So they've now got people gathered in groups. Calley reached this area approximately 9 a.m. Shortly after Calley's arrival, about 9:15, the Vietnamese who had been herded into the ditch were shot down by members of the 1st platoon. Estimates of the numbers killed vary from 75 to 150. Some witnesses told of huge holes being blown into bodies, limbs being shot off, and heads exploding. There was no question that there was ample bloodletting. Brooks's 2nd platoon, the platoon to the north, moved into the northern part of My Lai 4 with its 3 squads abreast. As they moved through the area, they shot down fleeing civilians in the hamlet and the nearby rice paddies. In some instances, grenades were thrown into family shelters. And others, the occupants, were called out and then shot down as they emerged. This goes on. At about 8:30 a.m., Captain Medina directed Lieutenant Brooks to move his platoon north into the rice fields to recover the weapons from VC killed by the gunships. So he goes north. The platoon entered Bin Tay, that's that village just over the river, and continued the pattern of atrocity begun in My Lai 4. In one instance, 10 to 20 women and children were rounded up and forced to squat in circular formation. Then one of the men in the platoon fired several rounds from his M79, this is a grenade launcher, into their midst. Those who were not killed by the grenade blasts were finished off by rifle fire from other members of the platoon. Other cases of rape and sodomy were reported. One girl was raped by 3 men in succession, and another was a victim of a 3-on-1 gang rape. It was a gruesome picture. This is terrible. It goes on, very blunt, in words that I care not to repeat. The dead were not only dead, but they were violated after they were dead. To me, it's always interesting how people can justify what they do in the aftermath of the terrible things they do. It's a lesson I learned early in life. This is the last thing I'll read before we take a break, and we'll need a break after this. This is a testimony of Lieutenant Calley. Just one short excerpt. Remember, he is not only the platoon leader, he's actually personally killing. At this point, they brought forward a witness they gave immunity to, and he has testified how he and Calley are jointly shooting the civilians. And the lawyer turns to Calley, talking about the time they had essentially women and children in a ditch. And here's the question to Callie. Question, what were the children in the ditch doing? Answer, I don't know. That's Callie. Lawyer, question, were the babies in their mother's arms? Answer, I guess so. Here's the lawyer. Question, and he poses this as a question. And the babies moved to attack? Answer from Callie, I expected at any moment they were about to make a counterbalance. Question, had they made any move to attack? Answer, no. That's Lieutenant Callie justifying his combat actions on the morning of March 16th, a couple of years later. All right, a very somber message, a very intense story. I'd like to take about a 10-minute break now and then come back, and I'd like to talk about the lessons that we need to draw for our own department from this. Thank you. I would now like to draw parallels to our department in many ways and sort of end up this morning's meeting with what lessons can we learn from all of this to keep ourselves on guard. My theme here, again, I repeat, is that co-joining of ethics and leadership. They're one and the same. You cannot be a positive, effective leader unless you have a very strong code of ethics and that you insist upon it. That's a belief I hold and have tried to mesh with this department. So let's begin by saying if we take the division that I talked about, the AmeriCal, and roughly equate that to the Department of Corrections, do we have the same sorts of command structures? Any views on that? And we do have a mic, and I'd like you to use the mic. Anybody would like to talk on the parallels between this division and our department in terms of its structure, not in terms of its actions? Any takers?
Sure, we're probably a military organization that's set up very much like from a division commander all the way down to the lieutenants or or sergeants in the field.
So we have a hierarchical chain of command.
Exactly.
Right. I think that's clear.
I'm sorry, sir.
I think that's very clear. Hierarchical chain of command. Do we have standard operating procedures in place?
Yes.
Okay, so that's an easy one. Are we governed by a set of laws, statutes? Like, they had the rule of land warfare, not followed. We certainly abide by rule of law. And Kathleen, what does that look like from your angle? What do you, whenever I set a policy, what are you doing to me?
We're looking first to see if it complies with the Constitution.
Make sure it complies with state and federal constitutional standards, and that it's uniform, it's not arbitrary and capricious, and that it's well-founded in law and in fact.
All right, that's keep that mic. Keep that mic. And Kathleen, not to lead, but just to get a straightforward answer. If you believe I'm purporting a policy that's in violation of Florida statute, what do you do?
Say, sir, that's not what the rule of law is, and the law requires us to do X. And then I guide you in terms of what the law requires and what your obligations are under the law.
Well, here's a hard question. In terms of your mindset, what's the first order of priority? To keep the department operating within the law or to protect the department from suits that could be brought up under the law?
We follow the law first.
That's a good answer. But that's very key. I'm afraid the AmeriCal, leaders in the AmeriCal division knew very well the rule of law. They knew you can't kill civilians. That code of silence that kicked in was a protection under the law. Code of silence. Do we have a code of silence in our department?
We have had it.
Would you like to talk about that?
We have in the past had a code of silence, not me per se, but there has been, prior to you being the secretary, a lot of people were kept quiet, maybe for out of loyalty or job security, but there has been.
All right, code of silence out of loyalty. We have people who believe that. Keep the mic. I won't make you suffer too much with this. What do we call people that break the code of silence? Whistleblowers. Snitches, rats. You can pass it off to one of your friends. Look, this is parallels to draw, I would say. Language. Use of language. What are the pejoratives we heard in the My Lai case? Some of the slur words we heard used. Anyone remember? Gook. Pinkville was actually a sub-hamlet with a name. What are the slur words we hear in our department? People don't conform to the unwritten code of silence. Snitch, rat. Is that healthy? No. We have to counsel people on how they speak. We really do. When I hammer home on that, it's because I remember things like this. And by the way, I chose one event now 40 years old. There were many other places I could have gone to draw events. Bosnia, Croatia, Rwanda, the Congo. But I chose one because this is very much an American one with American people of average, above and average intelligence. The corruption of language is almost, I would offer this, almost as corrosive as the corruption of law. And you have to guard against it. It's not a trivial matter. Sexual harassment begins almost invariably with a corruption of language. Let me see what I can get away with. Let me see the innuendo I can work in. Let me see how blatant I can make it before I get checked. And the converse of that is that insistence on silence. Where's Fran Barber? Give the mic to Fran, please. Fran, you asked me a question at the break. What was that question?
The question was, at what point is the code of silence considered corruption?
All right. Who wishes to get the mic and answer that? Ralph.
I say from the very beginning.
Why is that?
Because once it starts, there's no degrees of corruptness. It's either it is or it isn't.
Back to Fran.
And also, you indicated to me once before when we were talking, you said at any point, at any stage, at any rank, you have an obligation to question order.
That's right. The whole theme of this, drawing the line. When do you draw the line on ethics? Sam, when do you draw the line on ethics?
When you see something wrong.
And how soon after you see something wrong?
Immediately.
You draw it immediately. You've got to do that. It is, I think, a fact of life that the big corruptions begin with small infractions. They don't usually begin with big infractions. It's small infractions. It's looking the other way. It's getting quiet. It's not informing. If this was a serious matter, they would investigate it, whoever they are. If this was really bad, someone else would point that out. Got any wardens in the room? Parallels to this. If you had to take a correctional institution, about what level would you put it in the setting I described in the first hour? Warden Bryant.
It would have, sir, it would have some aspects of
division, although you don't have all the players with that.
Right.
But the warden in itself would be the commanding officer of that particular unit and would dictate, my feelings would be that it would dictate the philosophy or ideology as what to be expected and what will not be condoned in that environment.
Warden Humphreys, any of you? Thank you, Warden Bryant. Where would you put a correctional institution? Let's think of yours. Where would you put yours in this hierarchy?
Well, I agree with Warden Bryant. I think that the warden is the commander of the institution, and it is their responsibility to oversee that institution as the commander and to ensure that if there's any wrongdoing going on, that it's checked immediately, and that people are questioned and brought to accountability.
When I was speaking the first hour, even as I was speaking, I wondered if it would be more accurate to equate General Koster's division to the department. We've got 27,000. He had slightly under 20,000. Or to a correctional institution. And or if I should, in fact, say, actually consider Henderson, the colonel in command of the brigade, the warden. But it probably doesn't matter what you equate them to. The fact is we have and they had independent units that had to come together to work as a whole. The idea of independence, of leaders in charge of individual units, I think is a strong parallel between what we heard and what we do. And the personality and character and value set of that leader in that institution or that circuit and that circuit administrator is key. The tones that you set permeate the ranks almost instantly. It was my reflection by the time I got to be a battalion commander in the Army. It was uncanny. Whatever mood I was in, within 30 minutes of arriving in the unit area in the morning, they would know my mood more accurately than I knew my own mood. Was that yours, Colonel Grant? It's the innuendos. It's the small things. It's the manner of speech. Back to language again. It's how you stand, what you stand for, what you condone, what you don't, what you allow, what you disallow, and how forcefully you disallow it. When you have an independent unit, there are two things I think you have to keep in mind all the time. And now you see merging lessons drawn and parallels. They are acts of commission Any guesses on what the other one is?
Acts of omission.
Acts of omission. What you do and what you don't do. General Koster was, by all appearances, a good man. But he didn't check this, and he didn't report it. And Colonel Henderson was, by all appearances, a good man. But he didn't check, and he didn't report. He omitted the critical IG investigation that could not have righted the wrongs done on the morning of March the 16th, 1968, but probably could have ensured they didn't happen again elsewhere. Whether you're running a circuit, running a bureau, running a division of this department, running a prison or a region, your character permeates the ranks. Your management style permeates the ranks, but more your character. Character before all other things, which means your ethical code is prime. You've got to stand for what you stand for, and you must articulate that, and you must demonstrate that every minute of the working day. And for those in this room, even when you're not working, because that is observed as well. and becomes a standard. Paul, any lessons for an IG in this?
I would think that the lesson for all of us really is
There's a mic behind you, Paul.
part of being a leader is not only the turning on of the action, or the attack, if you will, but also saying that's enough, it's time to stop. And I think in a situation, even if Lieutenant Calley had come across a situation where some civilians were killed, he could have stopped it at that point by backing the troops up from that and insisting that it stop there and not continue on and participate himself. You can't be part of the crowd. You've got to be in charge. And saying go and saying stop are two very important acts of leadership, I think. Some of the most difficult ones are saying stop.
All right. A couple of things fall out of that. Selection of leaders. Training of leaders. In retrospect, someone should have noticed there was a fundamental weakness in Calley. I actually don't think Calley was redeemable. I don't think someone could have put him on the right path by the time he had grown to manhood. Listen to his testimony about the babies ready to counterbalance. That means attack. In their mother's arms. Does this guy got a screw loose or what? But why didn't someone notice? Why didn't some leader notice there was a problem with this guy? He later, at his court-martial, he said, I received no training on the Geneva Convention. This would govern the laws of land warfare. Personally, I can't believe that to be true. Somehow he may have missed the class or classes, but I think he had just no cognizance of what it meant. But others did, and they didn't seem to notice that he was the wrong guy for the job. How do you pick leaders? What do you look for in leaders, Wendell?
Credibility, experience.
Okay.
Credibility, experience.
All right.
Simply, I trust what they do and believe what they say.
You got to trust them. You got to believe them. When do leaders need to come to the fore? Can I have that, please? Mr. Grant, when do leaders need to come to the fore? Would you turn around and look at the group, please?
Sure. Leaders need to come to the fore when times are tough, when things are going well, when times are easy and everything is okay. Things are not too hard. Tough decisions don't have to be made. It's easy to be a leader, but it's much harder to be a leader when you have to say no, when you have to set standards, and especially when people are down, whether they've had something happen in the organization or to them personally or to the whole group. That's when you need leaders to stand up when times are hard. It's easy to be a leader when times are easy and there's nothing bad going on. So
when do we generally pick our leaders?
Well, we pick our leaders. I guess the answer would be when times are easy. But like you said, we were trying to pick people of character, and that's when character shows. When the going gets tough, the tough get going.
Right.
That kind of thing. It's very true. And leaders are the ones who set the standards for others to follow, and draw those lines early on for ethics.
Thank you. A lot of wisdom right there. We pick our leaders in routine times. Our leaders are exposed in tough times. Tough times become an opportunity to make assessments, to really take the character into measure. We don't look for tough times, but You know that old saw, every cloud has a silver lining? Take advantage of the difficulties that you face to see, number one, how you measure up. And number two, how those that work for you measure up. And those that work above you measure up. I think you used the word loyalty a while ago. What is our first loyalty to? Constitution, the law. That's our first loyalty. People forget that. Loyalty seems to have a human connection, and in many ways it does. You're loyal to your family. You're loyal to your spouse. You're loyal to your boss. You're loyal to your department. Those are all good things. But the first loyalty of a professional must be to the law. In this department, it must be to the law. It can never be to a person. If it comes to a person, who you're really being loyal to. You're being loyal at that point to yourself. The real assessment gets back to the chaplain. Why didn't the chaplain report? You think God didn't want him to report? Did he love the AmeriCal division more than he loved human justice and human life? I shudder to think that. His loyalty really was to himself. I could have my career affected by this. Have we heard that in this department? Mr. Sapp, would you like to talk about that? I'd like to put you on the spot.
What would you like me to talk about, sir?
How you push back when senior leadership is not doing the right thing?
Well, you stand up for what's right. When people try to put you in a position that you know you shouldn't be in, you tell them that you don't want to be in that position, and you will not conform or comply whatever it is they're asking you to do. And you put them on notice that this is not right, you can't do it, and the leader shouldn't do it. And that's how you have to just bluntly address it right there at that point. If you don't, if you take that step and you just turn your head, or you don't, or you actually get involved in it, then you become corrupt at that moment in time. And there's little that you can do to combat that once you take that step.
I couldn't think of a better answer myself. Thank you very much. Never get yourself in the position of looking for the opportunity to expose the impropriety of your boss. I think it's always a good rule to assume the best in the people you work for. And if they make a mistake or you think it's a mistake, I would say you have a moral, ethical obligation to point that out to them. Just as Kathleen Von Haney, the General Counsel's Department, will say, Mr. Secretary, I don't think we can do that. Statute here says we can't do that. She's not assuming I'm trying to break the law. She's assuming I didn't realize we couldn't do that. Good assumption. But notice how she points it out to me, or as does the Inspector General, or as does Mr. Sapp, or Mr. Grant, or Dr. Bedard. They point it out to me. That's good. That actually is being loyal. Being loyal to the law, being loyal to your superior at one and the same time. The assumptions, I believe, in the cases I described are straightforward. He means well, just doesn't realize what he can do and can't do. Sometimes you get some pushback, right, Ralph? Yes, who says I can't do that? But I will listen to the law. But I appreciate, as a senior, the questioning of that and causing me to think. Now, it gets a lot tougher when you have gone to your boss and told him or her a couple times, you can't do that. It's not right. And they don't listen. Then you got to make a very strong internal check. Is this a question of my personal morality? And does it pertain to everybody else? Or is it a question of the law, and therefore of ethics directly? And what do you do with that? That's a terrible moment if you ever face that. But it's a moment you have to be prepared to face. As Mr. Grant pointed out, the real key decisions, the real key test of leadership doesn't come in the easy times, it comes in the tough times. Gerald Wassey, you were an IG in this department for a while. in the middle 2000s. Any parallels between what you heard this morning and what you learned while you were here?
Yes. and and it was very difficult to make some of the decisions, but my loyalty was to the law and the way I was raised, and what I knew within myself was right and wrong, and I stuck by that. And but it was very difficult, because you really sit there alone, and it's just a decision that you have to make. Yeah. But it's very difficult. But I had a couple of good people with me, and they said, you know what's right, and we did. I did, and we did what was right, and got beat up every day.
All right. Thank you. There are all these external avenues, by the way, if things really get untenable for you. IG has strict instructions for me if he thinks that I'm out of control, and he's given me every signal to check my behavior. He used to go elsewhere. I don't mean personally. He used to go elsewhere with that report, with action to be taken. It's the only way you can use systems. What broke down, among other things, in the My Lai was systems. It's uncanny how many systems broke down. It's uncanny in our department how many systems broke down. Remember the MGT report of about a year and a quarter ago? Look, they just didn't look at leadership corruption or IG systems. They looked at maintenance, they looked at medical, they looked at budget, they looked at organizational, they looked at promotions, they looked at training, they looked at recruitment. Our systems were shutting down, one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. And what does it invariably lead to? It leads to corruption. It leads to followers who otherwise would be good, decent people doing the wrong thing. Consider the term hierarchical, what we are. Who's at the top of the hierarchy in this department? I am, right with me, all of you in this room. Some sort of rank order, but pretty close. Who's sort of middle level? Barbara, who's middle level?
Office supervisors, I'm sorry, office supervisors.
Okay. And in institutions, Mr. Red? Chiefs. Classification supervisor. All right, who's at the bottom, Mr. Red?
Correctional officers, secretaries, support staff.
I actually don't agree with that. Who's at the bottom? Yeah, inmates. Who was at the bottom in Vietnam in March of 1968? Right, the Gooks. The Gooks were at the bottom. They were the enemy. They had killed that sergeant with that booby trap 2 days. This was a unit outraged. Do our officers ever get outraged? Do they have a right to be outraged? I think they do. We had a good man here at Jefferson, almost lost his life, Mr. Sam, short time ago. You probably knew him, Martha. Outrage. He was doing his job, got hit twice from behind, never saw it. It broke his artery, almost bled to death internally. Doctor saved him. That's outrage. What do you do about that when you see soldiers outraged or officers are outraged?
Seize control, provide direct leadership.
Get it under control. Provide direct leadership. Take charge. Offenders are at the bottom of our pecking order. And they can cause us outrage, and they certainly have caused outrage in the communities. And they have done bad things. They are virtually powerless. We have all the power. That's a big parallel, by the way, between the setting in Vietnam and we have all the firepower. We can push this system pretty damn hard. Not a person here would like to be an inmate at the mercy of this system. As much as we stand for it and lead it and direct it, aside from the very fact of imprisonment, to be at the mercy of a system that can go awry unless we, the leaders, are vigilant, is an awful frightening thing. And how well it's run is depending on the leadership in this room. Our grievance system, for example, is meaningless unless we honor it. Even when we don't like the guy that keeps writing the damn grievances. We've got to honor it. It's our system. It's our system. That system was created for us, to keep us ethically straight. And we have to be vigilant about that. So vigilance is another big lesson here. It's when you're tired, when you want to go home, when you think everyone's gone to bed, and you've done your day's job, you have to say, what didn't I do? What am I not checking? There's an old saw in the military, that gets done well which the boss checks. Which means, say, if you don't look, that's where you got problems. And they may seem like small problems and someone else will eventually take care of them, but that's the whole theme of this class this morning. Small problems cause big problems. Small problems in systems can lead to breakdown in systems. Breakdown in systems is the loss of yet another safeguard. So drawing that line on ethics. Any other lessons? Chief of Staff? Anything else coming out of this?
I think, sir, a lot of it is being responsible for your actions and taking accountability as well. I think one of the things that Mr. Sapp and Mr. Wazia and I learned is that even though we knew we might be yelled at and livelihoods threatened, that
by who?
By certain individuals who are
no longer here.
No longer here. But you know, in all seriousness, you know, we knew that we were going into the lion's den, and still that we were able to talk with each other and reassure each other that we were doing the right thing. And I think there was strength in numbers there that helped, so you didn't feel like you were on your own. And we were able to laugh and joke through that those tough times, but by still holding fast. And I think you know, that's something that we can also learn, is to reassure each other about, in situations like we find ourselves today, that you know, we're doing the right thing.
Sure.
You know.
That's very well put. Enjoy your work. Be proud of what you do. Have fun. Find support groups. Look for camaraderie. But don't forget the seriousness of what you're doing. Who was the hero at My Lai? Clearly, who was the hero at My Lai? Helicopter Thompson. They threatened to court-martial Hugh Thompson. He landed a helicopter on a battlefield. You don't do that. Even in the Pierce Commission report, General Pierce himself goes through it. Oh, Thompson's a good man, did this, but he shouldn't have landed that helicopter on the battlefield. That's a major offense. Well, yeah. There was a congressman who said to Thompson, when Thompson testified, if there's anybody at My Lai should be court-martialed, should be you. What he was saying, you raised all this problem. Look what you did here. Terrible. Thompson was the hero. Look at his independent judgment, his character, his relentlessness. He couldn't get anybody else to respond to what he saw. He landed a helicopter. He saved 9 to 12 people himself at risk of his life. Took the Army 30 years to give him the Soldier's Award. You get the Soldier's Award for risking your life to save other lives. It's actually a non-combat medal. 30 years. His crew got it too, by the way. His door gunner was killed shortly thereafter. The other one survived. Thompson died a few years ago, age 62, cancer. He was the hero, but look at the independent judgment he had, his firmness, his resolve, his respect for the system. He went to his own commander. His commanders, by the way, did the right thing. They raised it. His chaplain raised it. It was at higher level it began to break down. Ridenour's another hero, a private soldier. He didn't graduate from West Point. No one commissioned him. Didn't get a retirement. He was just sickened by what he heard. So he wrote the Chief of Staff of the Army. People write me all the time. All the time. Big things, small things. Some of them are annoying. Some of them are personally insulting. But you have to listen. You have to listen. Wardens have to listen. Circuit administrators have to listen. Bureau chiefs have to listen. Somebody brings you a problem, listen. It's that reflex action would turn off, couldn't be wrong, couldn't be bad. Those bad things couldn't be happening. Or the messengers. Yeah, but he doesn't look really sharp. Not the brightest light bulb in the socket. Listen, and then make your judgments. I think there are many lessons to be drawn out of this and other things in life. Here's where I come down on this department, and this would really be the end of this 2-hour journey this morning. We are into life and death issues. I've taken the case that's the extreme of that, the power to kill, unleashed in a terrible, inhumane, despicable way. We don't have that sort of authorities to move, but we have absolute power over the lives of upwards of 300,000 people. Offenders, inmates, and our officer subordinates. Different degrees of power. I shouldn't say absolute power, but we have tremendous power. We have a tremendous obligation to the state. Public safety. That's life and death. Life and death occurs within our system. It can be abused if we let our guard down, if we let the code of silence, if we let language, if we let small infractions go unchecked. It can be strengthened and reassured if we have the confidence, the courage, the character to take a strong stand on ethics. From day one of my sojourn in this department, I have stressed ethics. That is not a theoretical, philosophical underpinning. It comes out of a life that sees what happens starkly when ethical codes and systems that govern life and death break down. We're in this together. And I appeal to you to take this lesson. Leadership is ethics. Ethics is leadership. And pass it down. Thank you very much.